President Trump is threatening to veto a bill authorizing billions of dollars in military spending unless Congress repeals an internet law known as Section 230. It gives websites legal protection over content posted by their users. In a tweet earlier, Mr. Trump called Section 230 a threat to national security and election integrity, adding if the law is, quote, not completely terminated as part of the National Defense Authorization Act, I will be forced to unequivocally veto the bill. So what does Section 230 actually do? It protects online platforms from being legally responsible for the actions of their users. It covers big names like Facebook and YouTube, but also some small, like the comment section on your favorite recipe website. Section 230 is not the first sticking point for President Trump when it comes to the defense bill, though. In July, he threatened to sink funding for it over a measure requiring the Pentagon to rename bases and other military assets that were named for Confederate leaders. Admiral Mike Mullen joins me now. He served as the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the nation's highest-ranking military officer from 2007 to 2011, during the transition from President George W. Bush to President Barack Obama. Admiral Mullen, welcome to Red and Blue. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Elaine. It's good to be with you.
So what would the impact be of failing to pass the National Defense Authorization Act?
Well, I think it's been quite a while since it has not been passed. The threat of a veto is, particularly for this bill, is not uncommon, not just in the case of President Trump. It's happened before. Usually, however, when that happens, there's a provision in the bill that can be taken out, and then the bill can be sent over. In this case, obviously, it'll be a little more challenging. And as I think about the sort of the timing of it, usually this is a bill that gets approved by the end of the year. We're already in our third month of execution in fiscal year 21, and that's the year that this bill applies to. So, in particular, I think it doesn't allow us to move into new areas that are laid out in the bill to high-end, important warfighting technologies to start new programs. We end up basically tied to whatever the past was in that regard. So it could have a significant impact in terms of making the kind of progress in those areas that is particularly important.
Well, I want to ask you about this presidential transition since you witnessed one yourself 12 years ago. This weekend, you expressed your concern with President Trump's staffing changes at the Pentagon since Election Day. Just this week, Christopher Mayer was ousted from his job, leading military efforts to combat ISIS. Now, the Trump administration is also drawing down troops from Iraq and Afghanistan. What do you think, Admiral, the potential impact of these changes are immediately and on the incoming administration?
Well, this transition certainly is not anything close to similar to the one I went through from President Bush to President Obama. President Bush and President Obama basically got together and said, we're going to do this together. And that set the tone, and that's actually what we did. The fact that Secretary of Defense Gates was going to stay on was significant. So it was a relatively smooth transition. Transitions are always difficult. They come, and transitions always present us in a more fragile way, if you will. This particular transition is exactly the opposite. Obviously, President Trump has chosen to not help out President-elect Joe Biden, and so it'll be that much more difficult on the Biden group to get in place, if you will. Biden's group is a very experienced group, so I have confidence they'll be okay. But as I said recently, and I just reiterate that right now, our enemies take advantage of transitions, and if we're in a fragile state right now, that could possibly happen. I am worried, as I said recently, with the new Trump loyalists who are now running the Pentagon. Not only are they Trump loyalists per se, but by and large, they're pretty young. They don't have much experience. And it's difficult for me to see a way in which they can do a lot of constructive things in the 50-plus days that we have left until President-elect Biden comes in. But they can do a lot of damage. Just recently today, the Iranian issue has come up again, and I worry a great deal about sort of drums beating, if you will, with respect to potentially striking Iran, which I think would be a disaster and a potential conflict that could spin out of control. We just recently moved an aircraft carrier. We're moving an aircraft carrier there as well. There was recently this secret meeting between Netanyahu and MBS, et cetera. So there's a lot going on in that part of the world right now. And the last thing we need is another another conflict in the Middle East.
I want to ask you about Afghanistan. You served in various positions of military leadership throughout the war in Afghanistan. I wonder what your thoughts are now about the Trump administration sitting down for negotiations with the Taliban.
Well, the negotiations, I mean, from what I can see, and I'm really just in the public world like you are, Elaine. From what I can see, the negotiations are very difficult. President Ghani was refusing to negotiate in the last day or two based on some things that he wants to have happen. It just needs to be done very carefully. And I think it needs to be done in a measured way. Like everyone else, I'd like to see all the troops come home. I think with the terrorist threat that is still there on that border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, it's hard to get there, because that terrorist threat still focuses on us. And playing it there, if you will, as opposed to playing it here, is much preferred. So I think the drawdown, certainly, I hope, is one that's well thought through in order to be able to continue to address that threat.
So come January 20th, when President-elect Biden is inaugurated, what do you see, Admiral, as the most pressing issues with not only our allies, of course, but also our adversaries?
Well, I think, in the national security, the most pressing issue for President Biden is obviously going to be the response to the pandemic and how we as a country continue or respond to the needs that are out there in this devastating time. With respect to national security, certainly the Iranian nuclear deal, I think, will be in play. Relationships with our allies and friends and alliances, I think reestablishing strength in NATO will be very important. I think longer term for President Biden, it's going to be China. I think we need to focus on China. I'm one that's believed we just gave China way too much running room. We need to draw the line and say that's enough. So I think that will be the biggest long-term challenge that President Biden has. But I also come from a background of it's hard to predict actually what the challenges will be. Those are the obvious ones. I think there will be others as well that are hard to say exactly how they will present themselves. So it's going to be a full plate for President Biden and his team in ways that during my lifetime, I don't think there's an equivalent.
You mentioned the pandemic, and I was reading a recent Inspector General DoD report that talked about pandemics as well as climate change as being non-traditional threats that are facing the country and facing the U.S. military. I wonder, first of all, what your thought is on the issue of climate change. Do you view that as a national security issue? And if so, what do you think needs to be done in the first 100 days or so of a Biden administration to address that?
There certainly are national security implications in the whole issue of climate change. And I think President-elect Biden has made it very clear that he is going to address that quickly. I know enough about Secretary of State, former Secretary of State Kerry's passion and focus on this issue. And so I wasn't surprised at all to see Secretary of State Kerry be put in the lead for this issue, and I think that's a good change. To include re-engaging and rejoining the Paris Accord and really focusing on this in a way that systematically and comprehensively we haven't done as a country. And clearly that's and inside that there are going to be implications for the military in terms of how we respond to that as well in support of where President Biden wants to take the country with respect to responding to climate change, which in the long run, I actually believe is an existential threat to the country, to include national security implications.
And the legacy of the past 4 years under the Trump administration, when it comes to that issue, this DOD Inspector General report talked about climate change potentially affecting military readiness. When you look at wildfires, for instance, threatening existing bases, these kinds of threats, as this Inspector General report pointed out, are very real and imminent.
Yeah, I think the military and the National Guard in particular has been terrific over the last, actually, many decades, the last 2 decades that I can count, in responding to natural disasters. My own involvement in places like Haiti or the earthquake and tsunami in Japan, what happened in Katrina, what happened in Banda Ecce. It seems as though all these events, they keep they're happening at a quicker pace, and that usually will involve some kind of military response, mostly along the lines of support and logistics, and including active duty support and logistics for, in particular, Guard responses, whether they're fires on the West Coast or floods in the center of the country. And it certainly, if you just look at the data, it's happening more and more and more. And I think it will involve a military response in a way similar to what's happened in recent times, and more frequently. And in that regard, certainly the military has to be ready to do that. So, and I think it is. I'm not overly concerned that they can't be ready for that, but it's something we need to pay attention to.
All right, former chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Elaine.